just out of curiosity, you mentioned that you were learning about open source licenses, and you also talked about how open source is not just the license, but the technology, the community, and all those things. So at that time when you were learning about open source and doing all these evaluations for the mergers and acquisitions team and all the other parts of your work, were you able to get into that community side of open source at all, or were you more focused on the licenses at the beginning?
Well, definitely my first experience was just even encountering the licenses, but it was wanting to learn more about how these get interpreted. And especially at the time that I was doing M&A, there was virtually no case law in the open source realm. You were relying on case law that had other theories attached to it, like copyright or patent law, to figure out what the risk profile really was. I don't think we had a actual decision in open source until around 2008 with the Jacobson versus Katzer decision. That was the first case holding that said, hey, this is an open source license and it is indeed enforceable. Up until that point, some people weren't even sure whether or not this actually would work in a court of law. So I just wanted to get to know more about how this ecosystem worked. And I started by attending continuing legal education seminars and other webinars and task groups that were focused on open source. And that's where I got to start learning about the community behind open source. So I remember meeting with Karen Copenhaver at one of these CLEs and Dave Marr, who had both been speakers at this particular CLE. And both of them were very encouraging of my interest in open source. In fact, Karen had pulled me aside to say, there aren't enough women in this area, keep up with it. So that was very exciting for me to have someone who is sitting up there on a CLE panel saying, do this, keep going, this is important. And I decided at that point, as opposed to just me going to CLEs and learning on my own, I needed to educate more of the legal community within Cincinnati. So I was involved with an intellectual property bar association that held seminars and conferences, and I proposed that we have an open source conference in Cincinnati. And I reached out to Dave to say, would you be willing to come to Cincinnati and talk about open source for me? He was really gracious and wonderful about doing this. So he was the corporate view on open source. And then I also got connected, and I honestly, I don't remember how I got connected to him, but Bruce Perrins, who is identified very strongly with the Debian project, he said he would come so long as I could dovetail the conference with Hamvention, which was happening in May in Dayton, Ohio. Which was, oh, if we can get Bruce Perrins at our conference, that's amazing. Yes, we will design the entire conference around Hamvention so that we can get Bruce Perrins to show up and talk to us about open source. And then the final person that we had, a couple other people speaking, of course, but the other really keynote speaker that we had was Bradley Kuhn, came because one of the people on the planning committee for this conference was a professor at the University of Cincinnati who had had Bradley Kuhn as a graduate student. At this time, Bradley was working for, I think it was the Software Freedom Law Center, and now he's with the Software Freedom Conservancy. But he agreed to come to the conference, to come back to Cincinnati since he had some roots there. And so we had a really incredible lineup. We had corporate with Dave Marr, Bruce Perrins for the Debian project, and we had Bradley Kuhn from the litigation and enforcement perspective being with the Law Center. This was amazing to get this in Cincinnati. And this was around maybe 2007, 2008 that we had this conference. Planning this event was probably my first real lesson in the power of community, because all of these people, from Dave Marr, who had just met me in passing at a CLE event, to these giants of open source like Bruce Perens and Bradley Kuhn, none of them knew me as anyone in the open source community, but they were all willing to come and share their knowledge. So it's kind of like the saying goes, it takes a village, and the connections of the people on this planning committee, we all managed to make it happen.
It sounds like it was such an amazing event and provided a lot of information and different viewpoints into open source from all those pillars that you were talking about, like the law, the technology, the community, and all those things. Do you remember what impact the conference had to people who were attending it?
Well, we had over 100 people come to this conference. So that was a testament to how people were hungry for this information and really wanted to hear from the people who were intimately engaged with open source and understand what the issues were. Eventually, this conference ended up morphing into a larger tech conference that was run by Northern Kentucky University, and they had a full day conference related to all sorts of computer related issues and technologies and hackathons, workshops, languages, etc. But then they grafted in a legal track to their conference, and I think it's still going on today.
Wow.
Oh, that's amazing. I love to hear that. Um, I'm also curious, like at one point you mentioned that I think with the mergers and acquisitions team, someone told you to just go and dig into this whole open source thing because you have some tech background. I don't know if you were still with that team and company at the time when you organized the conference, but if you were, I wonder if you took any of your colleagues to the conference, or what other ways did you use once you learned about open source to help them understand what it was?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there were people from my own law firm who came, but I think even more broadly is that I wanted it to be a rising tide raises all ships sort of perspective. I just wanted to increase the acumen of open source across all of the law firms in Cincinnati that I felt needed to be part of understanding this so they can advise their own clients. And it was a really interesting thing being part of this intellectual property bar association, because it was almost entirely populated with law firms who were ordinarily competitive to each other, competitive with regard to getting clients. But in this space of learning, we all worked together to try to help each other understand legal risks and legal issues so that we could be better lawyers. And open source fit really neatly into that entire rubric.
So you were kind of, through that collaboration, you were sort of doing open source while still learning about open source.
Yes, I guess so.